before Egypt raised its pyramids, before Babylon carved laws into clay, and long before Rome dreamed of empire. There was another world beneath history older, quieter, and almost completely forgotten. It was a world of drowned coastlines, green deserts, stone circles, buried ancestors, and villages learning how to become civilization before anyone had a word for it. Tonight, we follow the traces left behind in bone, ash, grain, clay, and silence, searching for the lost foundations of the ancient world. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Long before the first stone blocks rise into pyramids, before Babylon scratches its laws into clay, before Rome is even a rumour in the hills of Italy, there is another world lying underneath history like an older shoreline beneath the sea. It has no pharaohs, no emperors, no royal inscriptions announcing victories to the gods. Most of its names vanish completely, yet its people walk through landscapes already becoming the foundations of everything later civilizations will claim as their own. River valleys, seasonal plains, limestone hills, lake margins, coastlines now drowned, and deserts that are not yet deserts. Picture a dawn somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean world, thousands of years before the famous kingdoms. Smoke rises from low hearths, dogs move at the edge of a settlement, alert to movement beyond the last houses. Nearby, grain heads tremble in the morning wind. Not yet the obedient fields of later farmers, but already watched and slowly changed by human hands. A woman grinds seeds on stone, leaving wear marks on the tool that will survive longer than any memory of her voice. A man checks a blade of obsidian, black and sharp as frozen water, brought from a place far away by paths no map records. Nothing announces that they're living before history. To them, this is simply life. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, because the world before Egypt, Babylon, and Rome is not empty background. It is the hidden beginning. It is easy to imagine civilization as something that suddenly appears when kings arrive. Walls rise, scribes count grain, and armies march. But archaeology has made that picture impossible, long before the great capitals of antiquity. People are already creating social worlds with rules, obligations, sacred places, remembered dead, and careful relationships with animals, plants, stone, water, and sky. The difficulty is that this older world speaks without words. It does not explain itself. It leaves charred seeds, broken beads, polished axes, clay figurines, burials beneath floors, painted walls, hearths, grinding stones, animal bones cut by flint, and sometimes settlements sealed beneath earth. Archaeologists read these traces slowly, like a language with most of its grammar missing. What survives in the record suggests intelligence, planning, cooperation, and ritual depth. But the evidence remains incomplete. No grave can tell us exactly what grief meant. No carved animal can reveal the full shape of belief. No abandoned village can say whether its people left because of drought, conflict, disease, opportunity, or some mixture no one can recover. Still, the traces overturn the old assumption that humanity lives in darkness until the first kingdoms switch on the light. The people of this lost world are not waiting to become civilized. They are experimenting with many ways of being human. Some remain mobile, moving with herds, seasons, fish runs, fruiting trees, and changing water. Others return to favoured places again and again, building memory into the land before they build permanent towns. Some store food. Some shape wild plants toward domestication. Some gather in ritual centres that seem too deliberate for the old idea of small, scattered bands. Scholars still debate how quickly these changes happen and what drives them most strongly, but the direction is unmistakable. People are binding themselves more tightly to place, to one another, and to the future. The earliest road towards civilization is not only a road toward comfort, it is also a road toward heavier labour, narrower diets, new diseases, sharper inequalities, and deeper dependence on fragile systems. Farming eventually feeds more people, but it also asks more from them. Settlements protect memory, but they concentrate waste, illness, and tension. Storage creates security, but it also creates the question of who controls the grain. The lost world before the famous empires is therefore not a peaceful golden age, and not a primitive waiting room. It is a long age of experiments, some brilliant, some costly, many irreversible. In this older landscape, the future is scattered in fragments, a clay-lined pit full of grain hints at accounting before writing. A shaped bead hints at identity and exchange. A human skull treated differently from the rest of the body hints at ancestors who remain socially present after death. A wall may hint at danger, flood control, or the desire to mark inside from outside. Burned layers may speak of accident, attack, ritual closure, or daily life gone wrong. The same evidence can carry several possible meanings, and that uncertainty is part of the mystery itself. These people eat, sleep, mourn, fear, cooperate, compete, and hope. Yet the inner logic of their world is mostly gone. What later civilizations inherit from them is enormous. Egypt does not invent the Nile as a sacred landscape from nothing. Babylon does not create urban life out of empty mud. Rome does not begin the human story of roads, law, hierarchy, labour, and memory. Long before those names become famous, communities are learning how to live with rivers that flood and retreat, how to gather surplus, how to organise work beyond the household, and how to mark special places so memory can outlive the individual body. Later kings will build on these deeper habits. Later priests will inherit older gestures. Later scribes will record systems whose roots begin before writing exists. Much of this world is physically lost. It lies under towns, river silt, desert sand, farmland, reservoirs, or the sea. Coastlines change, and places where people once camped and fished are swallowed by rising water. Elsewhere, grassland becomes desert. Lakes shrink into salt flats, and fertile corridors become harsh frontiers. The map of the ancient world before Egypt, Babylon, and Rome is not the map we know now. Some important places may be gone beyond easy recovery, leaving only indirect clues that people were there. And yet, enough remains. Under the famous history of kings stands a longer history of unnamed builders. Under the written record lies a deeper archive of bone, seed, ash, pigment, stone, and silence. The story begins not with crowns, but with hands cutting reeds beside water, pressing clay around a hearth, shaping a stone blade, placing food beside the dead, and carrying obsidian across mountains. This is the world before the world we were taught to remember. And its greatest mystery is not that it disappeared, it is that so much of what came later began there. The older world begins on an earth still shaking off the ice age, not shaking in the sudden way of an earthquake, but in the slower, stranger way of climate, water, vegetation, and animal life rearranging themselves across centuries. For generations, human beings have lived beside ice sheets, cold steppes, open grasslands, and herds moving across enormous distances. Then, the world warms, not evenly, not gently everywhere, and not in a way anyone alive can understand as a single event. The change comes through seasons that feel different from the stories of grandparents, through rivers cutting new paths, through forests creeping into old hunting grounds, through familiar animals becoming fewer, and through shorelines moving inland beyond memory. At the height of the last glacial age, so much water is locked in ice that the seas stand far lower than they do now. Lands that are drowned today lie open under the sky. Britain is joined to Europe by a broad plain. The Persian Gulf is not the same Gulf later sailors will know, but a low basin with rivers and wetlands. Around the Mediterranean and the Near East, coastal shelves stretch outward, offering spaces for camps and fishing grounds that now sleep beneath the water when the ice melts. The sea advances into valleys, swallows marshes, breaks old paths, and turns remembered places into underwater silence. For the people living through it, the end of the Ice Age is not a single apocalypse. It is a long negotiation with instability. Some changes bring opportunity. Warmer conditions allow new plants to spread, woodlands expand, lakes fill, wetlands attract birds, fish, reeds, and animals. A valley that was once harsh may become generous, but other changes unsettle older ways of life. Open grassland shrinks. Great cold-adapted animals decline or vanish in many regions. Mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, giant deer and other large beasts leave behind bones, art, and absence. Scholars still debate the balance between climate pressure and human hunting in these extinctions, and it differs from place to place, but no single explanation fully accounts for the pattern everywhere. This matters because human society is tied to the living map, a group that knows the seasonal movement of reindeer, wild cattle, gazelle, or horse knows more than food. It knows timing, territory, danger, stories, and inherited skill. When herds shift, the old knowledge becomes less certain. People must watch more carefully. They must test new foods, return to different places, learn which plants can be gathered in quantity, which roots survive drought, which river bends still hold fish after a flood. Survival becomes less about following one ancient rhythm and more about reading a changing world. In parts of Southwest Asia, this changing world encourages a remarkable intensity of attention. Wild cereals grow in dense stands where hills, valleys, and seasonal moisture create favourable conditions. People collect them long before true farming. They cut stalks, carry seeds, grind grain, roast meals, and perhaps return to the same patches year after year. A grinding stone may look humble, but it marks a profound shift in relationship. It means time spent processing small seeds instead of simply cutting meat from a carcass. It means knowledge of ripening, storage, texture, taste, and labour. The landscape is no longer only hunted through, it is harvested, watched, and remembered. The climate does not move in a straight line. After warming begins, there are reversals, pulses, and shocks. One of the most important is the Younger Dryas, a return to colder and drier conditions that begins roughly 12,900 years ago and lasts more than a millennium. Its effects are not the same everywhere, but in the eastern Mediterranean and Near East, it appears to put stress on some communities used to richer local resources. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how directly this cold snap pushes people toward cultivation. But it stands like a hard interruption in the story, a warning that depending on a place can become dangerous when the place itself changes. Under these pressures, people experiment. Some remain highly mobile because movement is still the best answer. Others settle for longer periods near reliable water, nut trees, grain stands, or fishing grounds. In the Levant, communities associated with the Natufian culture build houses, use sickle blades, bury their dead with care, and sometimes live in settlements that feel more rooted than earlier hunter-gatherer camps. They are not farmers in the full later sense. Yet they are not simply wandering bands either. They stand in a threshold world, where people can still hunt and gather while also investing deeply in particular places. That threshold is one of the most important features of the lost world before the famous civilizations. It is not a clean before and after moment. No one wakes one morning and invents civilization. Instead, human choices gather weight. A camp becomes a seasonal base. A plant that is gathered becomes a plant that is encouraged. An animal that is hunted becomes an animal that is managed. A burial place becomes an ancestral claim. Each step may seem small, but together they pull people into new forms of dependence. Rivers help write the first draft of that story. The Nile, the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Jordan, and many smaller streams create corridors of life through landscapes that can shift between generosity and hardship. Floods bring silt and fish, but also danger. Marshes feed people, but they can also isolate them. Seasonal water teaches patience and timing. Long before kings command irrigation works, people are already learning that water is both gift and problem. There is a quieter consequence too. As environments become richer in some places and less reliable in others, human groups likely meet, separate, merge, and exchange ideas more often than the old image of isolated prehistoric bands allows. A shell travels inland. Obsidian from volcanic sources turns up in places where no volcano is visible. What survives in the record suggests movement not only of objects, but of habits and meanings. By the time the famous ancient civilizations are still far in the future, the essential drama has already begun. Human beings are no longer merely adapting to nature in the old sense. They harvest plants and alter where seeds fall. They hunt animals and reshape animal populations. They burn, clear, store, build, bury, and return. The land changes them, and they begin to change the land in ways that grow more powerful with each generation. The lost world before Egypt, Babylon. And Rome is born from this unstable partnership and earth after ice, and a species learning that survival can become settlement. Settlement can become memory, and memory can become the first foundation of history. In the hills of southeastern Anatolia, long before the first cities of Mesopotamia spread across the southern plains, stone pillars stand in circles under the open sky. They are not the work of pharaohs, and they are not raised by armies obeying a palace. There are no palace archives here, no king lists, no tax records, no written prayers, yet the stones are massive, carefully shaped, and covered with animals that seem to move between the human world and something older, wilder, and less easily named. Foxes, snakes, boars, birds, scorpions, and strange abstract signs appear on their surfaces, carved by people who are still living close to the world of hunters, foragers, seasonal movement, and uncertain harvests. This is the shock of Göbekli Tepe monumentality before cities, ritual before kings, and organization before the kind of government later ages would expect to find behind such work. The site does not fit comfortably into the old, simple story of civilization. For a long time, many assumed that people first settled, farmed, stored surplus, built villages, and only then had the time and power to create large ceremonial monuments. Food came first, then temples. Necessity came first, then belief. But Göbekli Tepe unsettles that order. Its earliest monumental enclosures belong to a time when full farming is only beginning in the wider region, and when many communities still depend heavily on wild animals and wild plants. The people who carve and raise these pillars are not primitive in any meaningful sense. They are skilled observers, engineers of stone, organizers of labor, and makers of symbols. What they do suggests that shared belief, feasting, memory, and ritual obligation may help pull people together before cities become possible. The pillars themselves are shaped like tall, narrow bodies. Some have carved arms and hands, resting almost silently along their sides, as if the stones are not merely supports, but presences. They stand in circular or oval enclosures, facing inward, surrounding central pillars that dominate the space. The stone is limestone, cut from nearby bedrock, shaped with stone tools, moved, set upright, and arranged with care. None of this requires machines, but it requires coordination. People must quarry, plan, carry, feed workers, remember designs, and agree that the work matters enough to continue. That agreement may be the most important tool of all. No one knows exactly what happens there. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate whether Göbekli Tepe is best understood as a ritual centre, a gathering place, a place of feasting, a monument to ancestors, a symbolic landscape of dangerous animals, or some combination of these. There is no single explanation that fully accounts for the site. It has no obvious domestic life in its earliest monumental zones, no ordinary village layout like later farming settlements. Instead, it seems set apart. People come to it, work at it, perhaps gather around it at certain times, and then eventually bury parts of it deliberately under tons of fill. That burial is one of its strangest details. The enclosures are not simply abandoned to collapse. They are covered, as if closure itself is part of the ritual life of the place. Around the same broad region and era, other sites add depth to the mystery. Nivala Chori, now submerged by a reservoir, also held T-shaped pillars and special buildings. Karahan Tepe and other nearby places suggest that Göbekli Tepe is not a lone miracle, but part of a wider world of symbolic building in the early Neolithic of Upper Mesopotamia and Anatolia. The famous site may be the best known, but it is not the only clue. What survives in the record suggests a network of communities sharing ideas about stone, animals, bodies, and sacred space before the rise of urban states. These places make the lost world feel less like a scattered darkness and more like a cultural landscape with its own rules. The animals carved on the stones are not gentle decorations. Many are dangerous, watchful, or powerful. Snakes slide across stone. Boars appear with bristling force. Birds stand with long necks and sharp beaks. Predators and scavengers occupy the walls of a world where death is close and not hidden away. This is not the later temple art of orderly gods seated on thrones. It feels more like a symbolic map of forces surrounding human life animals that hunt, bite, feed, threaten, guide, or consume. Some researchers connect certain imagery to death rituals or sky burial practices, though the evidence is debated. Others see mythic beings, clan symbols, or memories of a world structured through animal powers. The truth may be more complex than any single modern label. What is clear is that the people who build these places are already capable of thinking far beyond immediate survival. They invest labour in forms that do not directly fill the stomach. Yet the boundary between ritual and survival may be misleading. In small-scale societies, gathering people together for ceremony can also create alliances, marriages, exchange, obligations, shared identity, and cooperation. A feast can feed the body and bind the group. A monument can honour unseen powers and also make human communities visible to themselves. A sacred place can become a centre of memory where scattered groups return and recognise one another. This may help explain one of the great turning points in human history. Perhaps people do not build ritual centres because farming has already made them settled and powerful. Perhaps, in some places, ritual gathering helps create the need for more reliable food. If many people come together at certain times, they require food in quantity. Wild grain, hunted gazelle, gathered nuts, and stored supplies become part of the social machinery. Over generations, the pressure to provide for gatherings may encourage more intensive harvesting, storage, and eventually cultivation. This idea is still debated, and no single model explains the entire Neolithic transition, but it reminds us that belief can be practical in ways modern categories often miss. The world of the monument builders is therefore not separate from the climate story that came before. After ice, landscapes change, resources shift, and people learn to return to certain places with greater intensity. Göbekli Tepe rises inside that larger transformation. It shows a humanity already organizing around more than hunger. These people know stone, season, animal behavior, labor, and memory. They live before writing, but not before meaning. They live before kings, but not before authority. Someone knows where the stones should stand. Someone remembers the shapes. Someone persuades others to help. Whether that authority belongs to elders, ritual specialists, skilled carvers, lineage groups, or temporary leaders, it is real enough to leave pillars in the earth for more than 10,000 years. And then, in time, the enclosures are filled, the carved animals disappear under rubble, the hill becomes quiet, later ages pass over it without knowing what sleeps beneath their feet, empires rise far away, and kings claim to be the beginning of order. But under the soil, the older truth remains. Before Egypt raises pyramids, before Babylon writes law, before Rome builds roads across continents, people without cities have already gathered in the hills and raised a stone world for reasons still not fully understood. Once people begin returning to the same places, the land itself starts to remember them. Paths harden between water, field, hillside, and hearth. Ash piles grow where meals are cooked again and again. Burials gather beneath floors or near houses, tying the living to ground that is no longer merely useful, but inherited. In the Fertile Crescent, Anatolia, and the Levant, this slow attachment to place becomes one of the most important transformations in human history. The first villages take root not as miniature cities and not as simple farming colonies, but as fragile experiments in staying. The change is easy to underestimate because mud brick does not look as dramatic as a carved pillar or a royal tomb. But the first permanent or semi-permanent houses are revolutionary in their own quiet way. They make life heavier. A mobile camp can be packed, abandoned, or remade somewhere else. A house asks people to return. It holds tools, food, memories, children, old people, stored seeds, sleeping places, and the dead. Its walls mark an inside and an outside. Its repair becomes part of the yearly rhythm. When people build houses from earth, straw, timber, reeds, and stone, they're also building a new relationship with time. In the Levant, early communities grow from older forager traditions into more settled village life. In northern Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Zagros foothills, similar changes take different local forms. There is no single birthplace of the village, no one neat line moving from wilderness to civilization. Instead, there are many centers of experimentation. Some groups cultivate cereals such as wheat and barley. Others manage goats, sheep, pigs, or cattle at different times and places. Some still depend heavily on wild resources while adding cultivated plants to their lives. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how much choice, pressure, accident, and environmental opportunity shape the process. But what survives in the record suggests a mosaic rather than a sudden invention. Early farming is not simply the discovery that seeds grow when planted. Human beings surely know that plants grow from seeds long before agriculture becomes a way of life. The deeper change is commitment. To farm is to plan months ahead, to protect a patch of ground, to harvest at the right moment, to store against hunger, and to accept the risk that frost, drought, insects, flood, or conflict may ruin the work. It means that food is no longer only found in the world. It is expected from a future humans have tried to arrange. That expectation changes the mind. It changes family life, labour, season, property, and fear. Domestication itself is visible in tiny details. Wild cereal heads shatter naturally, scattering seeds when ripe. For a wild plant, this is success. For a human harvester, it is loss. Over generations, when people gather and replant seeds from plants that hold together longer, the plant changes, the races becomes tougher, seeds become larger, a field slowly becomes less wild. Though no one may understand this in modern genetic terms, animals change too. Herd management can leave traces in age and sex patterns in bones, in the size of animals, and in the marks of enclosure or slaughter. The first farmers are not merely taking from nature, They are entering into a demanding partnership with species that will reshape human history. Daily life in these villages is physical, repetitive, and intimate. Grain must be cut, carried, dried, stored, ground, cooked, and protected from pests. Grinding grain on stone is hard labour, often done for hours, and it leaves marks not only on tools but on bodies. Knees, spines, shoulders, and teeth carry the cost. The earliest village people may eat more predictably than some foragers in certain seasons, but their diets can also become narrower. Close living with animals and waste increases the risk of disease. More children can be supported, but more mouths must be fed. Settlement brings security and vulnerability at the same time. The houses reveal a world deeply different from later urban life. Some are round, some rectangular, some clustered so tightly that movement between them must be carefully managed. Roofs may serve as workspaces. Floors are replastered. Hearths are rebuilt. Storage bins sit close to living areas. In some communities, the dead are placed beneath house floors, sometimes with skulls later removed, plastered, painted, or treated in special ways. That practice is one of the most haunting details of the early village world. It suggests that ancestors remain close, perhaps protective, perhaps socially powerful, perhaps part of household identity. No single explanation fully accounts for these skull rituals, but they show that the village is not only an economic settlement, it is a place where memory is physically kept underfoot. Jericho, in the Jordan Valley, offers one of the most famous glimpses of this transformation. Its early walls and tower have often been described as defences, but the interpretation is not settled. They may have protected against floods, marked communal identity, organised labour, or served several functions at once. What matters is that people are already mobilising effort on a scale beyond a single household. A tower of stone in a pre-urban settlement is not just architecture. It is social evidence. Someone gathers workers, someone maintains purpose. The community agrees, or is persuaded, that shared construction matters. Farther north and east, other settlements show different paths. In the Zagros region, early goat management develops in mountain environments. In Anatolia, cereal cultivation and village life take forms shaped by local ecology. Across the region, obsidian moves from volcanic sources into distant communities, reminding us that even early villages are not isolated. A person living in a mud brick house may handle stone from far away, shell from another landscape, or pigments carried along exchange routes older than written trade. The village is rooted, but its world is wide. This is one of the paradoxes of the first settled life. Staying in one place does not mean becoming smaller. In some ways, it makes connection more important. Stored food, marriage ties, ritual gatherings, craft skills, and rare materials link communities across valleys and mountains. Ideas travel with people, objects, and perhaps stories. A building method appears here, a burial practice there, a tool form somewhere else. The record is broken. But the pattern suggests a world of communication long before caravans and royal roads. As villages take root, time thickens around them. Children grow up knowing particular walls, graves, fields, and paths. The dead accumulate. Repairs layer over repairs. A settlement mound begins to form as generations build on the remains of earlier homes. These mounds, later called tells in many parts of the Near East, become artificial hills made of human life compressed into earth. They are among the most powerful symbols of the ancient world before history. People literally living on top of memory, raising the ground beneath themselves one generation at a time. From the outside, these first villages may look humble. No palaces dominate them. No written laws survive from their walls. No kings carve their names into stone. Yet inside them, the future is gathering force. Food production, storage, household ancestry, communal labor, exchange, disease, inheritance, and territorial attachment are all taking shape. The village is not yet the city, but it contains the city's first deep roots, and beneath the later grandeur of Egypt, Babylon, and Rome, there remains this quieter beginning mud brick, grain dust, animal breath, buried ancestors, and the strange courage of people deciding to stay. By the time the first towns begin to swell from clusters of houses into dense human landscapes, the village has already changed the meaning of ordinary life. A home is no longer just a shelter against weather. It is a workplace, a storeroom, a shrine, a burial place, a memory chamber, and sometimes a statement about how people belong to one another. Nowhere does this early settled world feel more intimate, more strange, and more difficult to simplify than at Çatalhöyük. On the Konya plain of central Anatolia, from a distance, it would not have looked like a city in the later sense. There are no streets in the familiar pattern, no palace rising above the roofs, no obvious temple separated from common houses, no monumental gate declaring power. Yet thousands of people live there across many generations, packed into a landscape of mud brick rooms so close together that the settlement itself feels almost like one living organism. The houses press against one another wall to wall. Movement appears to happen largely across rooftops, with people entering rooms by ladders through openings in the ceiling. Smoke from hearths and ovens rises through the same upper spaces where people walk, work, gossip, carry tools, dry food, and watch the plain beyond the mound. Inside, rooms are carefully maintained. Floors and walls are replastered again and again, sometimes so many times that the repeated layers become a physical record of care. Platforms line the interior. Hearths and ovens hold the warmth and ash of daily meals. Storage areas, sleeping spaces, work zones, and symbolic displays are woven together. The domestic and the sacred are not cleanly separated, at least not in any way that later urban people would instantly recognize. This is one of the great surprises of Çatalhöyük. The settlement is large, complex and enduring, yet it does not show obvious signs of centralized authority. There are no grand elite residences that clearly dominate the rest. There is no palace. There is no single temple precinct towering over ordinary life. Some houses are richer in paintings, installations, or burials than others, and scholars still debate what those differences mean. But the pattern does not easily match later societies ruled by kings and priests. What survives in the record suggests a community with social distinctions, memory, ritual importance, and perhaps influential households, but not yet the sharp architecture of state power. It is a town before the city's hierarchy hardens. Inside the houses, the dead remain close. Many people are buried beneath platforms, often under the floors where the living continue to sleep, cook, and work. Bodies are sometimes placed in tightly flexed positions, wrapped, and interred within the house itself. In some cases, skulls are removed or handled after burial, echoing wider Neolithic traditions of ancestor treatment. The meaning remains uncertain. These burials may mark household continuity, ancestry, belonging, ritual obligation, or social memory. No single explanation fully accounts for all of them, but the physical closeness is undeniable. Life at Çatalhöyük unfolds literally above the dead. A child may grow up in a room where grandparents, parents, siblings, or earlier occupants lie beneath the floor, turning the house into a layered archive of bodies and time. The walls deepen the mystery. Some are painted with geometric patterns, handprints, vultures, hunting scenes, wild cattle, deer, and other animals. Bullhorns, especially from aurochs, are sometimes set into benches or walls, creating powerful interior features. These are not casual decorations. They must have required selection, preparation, placement, and shared understanding. Wild animals are especially prominent in the symbolic life of the settlement. Even though domestic animals and cultivated plants are central to survival, that contrast is revealing. People may be living in houses, eating grain, managing sheep and goats, and relying on settled routines. Yet their imagination still reaches toward the dangerous wild world beyond the mound. The wild bull, huge and difficult to control, seems to carry a force that domesticated life has not erased. One famous wall painting has often been interpreted as a map of the settlement beneath an erupting volcano, possibly Hassan Dar in the distance. It is a tempting image, one of the world's earliest landscape paintings, perhaps even a map, but scholars still debate this interpretation. It may represent houses and a volcano, or it may be a patterned design with meanings modern observers are too eager to recognize. This is the tension that runs through Çatalhöyük. It constantly invites interpretation, then resists certainty. The evidence is rich, but it does not speak plainly. Daily life is not all ritual and mystery. It is also crowded, smoky, laborious, and practical. Grain must be processed, food must be cooked, tools must be made and repaired. Obsidian, brought from volcanic sources, is shaped into sharp blades and exchanged across wider networks. Baskets, textiles, wooden objects, clay balls, bone tools, beads, and figurines move through the hands of people whose names are gone. The air inside houses may have been thick with smoke from hearths, and skeletal evidence hints at the strains of labour, disease, and close living. Settlement brings people together, but it also brings waste, infection, conflict, and the ordinary difficulty of sharing space with many others. Even so, Çatalhöyük endures for a long time. Its people rebuild houses in place, sometimes following earlier layouts, as if continuity matters. The settlement mound grows as old buildings are filled, levelled, and built over. The town becomes a human-made hill, rising from generations of plaster, ash, mud brick, bone, and memory. In this, it continues the pattern of the first villages, but on a larger and more intense scale. The land is no longer only occupied, it is accumulated. One lesser-known detail is how carefully some houses appear to have been closed or cleaned before abandonment. Objects may be removed, spaces filled, or features treated in ways that suggest departure is not always casual. A house can have a life cycle. It is born in construction, renewed through plastering, inhabited through meals and burials, transformed by ritual installations, and eventually closed. This makes the settlement feel less like a random cluster of shelters, and more like a social world in which buildings themselves have biographies. Yet for all its richness, Çatalhöyük remains difficult to place in a straight line toward later civilization. It is not simply a primitive city waiting to become Babylon. It is its own experiment. It shows that large populations can live densely without obvious kings. It shows that ritual can be embedded in houses rather than separated into official temples. It shows that farming communities may still imagine themselves through wild animals and ancestral bodies. It shows that complexity does not always look like hierarchy, and that the road to civilization has branches, some of which do not lead directly to empires. This is why the lost world before Egypt, Babylon and Rome is so important. It does not merely explain where cities came from. It reveals possibilities that later history narrowed. At Çatalhöyük, power may be dispersed through households, memory, ritual knowledge, age, skill, or kinship in ways archaeology can only partly recover. People live close together, but not yet under the shadow of a palace. They build intensely, but not monumentally. They bury their dead beneath the floor, paint the walls, climb through roofs, work obsidian, grind grain, and watch the plain from a town without streets. It is not a simple beginning, it is a lost alternative, preserved in mud brick and plaster, reminding us that civilization was never one inevitable path, but a series of choices made in rooms filled with smoke, memory, and silence. Far to the west of the early villages and stone monuments, another lost world is breathing under a sky that modern eyes would hardly recognize. The Sahara, now imagined as a kingdom of sand, heat, stone, and distance, is alive with water. Lakes shine across basins that are dry today. Rivers and seasonal streams cut through grasslands. Fish move through channels where only dust remains now. Crocodiles, hippos, elephants, antelope, giraffes, and cattle occupy a landscape that seems almost impossible when compared with the desert that later swallows it. This is the Green Sahara, one of the most dramatic vanished environments in human history, and it holds a human story that still feels half hidden behind rock, bone, and silence. During the African humid period, beginning after the last ice age and lasting for thousands of years, changes in Earth's orbit help shift monsoon rains farther north. The result is not a uniform paradise, and not every part of the Sahara becomes lush in the same way. But vast areas that are now brutally dry support grasslands, wetlands, lakes, and human life. The desert border moves. What will later become a barrier becomes a corridor. People travel, hunt, fish, herd, paint, bury their dead, and make homes in places that will eventually become nearly uninhabitable. The map of North Africa is transformed so completely that it warns us how temporary even the most permanent-looking landscapes can be. The people of this green world leave some of their most powerful traces on stone. Across the Sahara, rock art shows animals that no longer belong to the region's modern surface giraffes with long bending necks, elephants, wild cattle, swimmers, hunters, dancers, and later herders with domesticated animals. These images are not simple decoration. They are fragments of perception, memory, and meaning. A painted or carved animal may record what people saw, what they valued, what they feared, or what they believed connected the human world to forces beyond daily survival. Scholars still debate how to interpret many scenes, because the artist left no written explanation. But the images prove that the Sahara was once home to communities with rich symbolic lives and deep environmental knowledge. One of the most haunting places is the region of Tassili Naja, where thousands of paintings and engravings cover rock shelters and cliffs. Some scenes show human figures in motion, bodies decorated or stylized, animals moving in groups, and strange forms that have inspired many popular theories. Some of those theories, especially claims of ancient astronauts or lost advanced visitors, are unsupported and tell us more about modern imagination than ancient reality. The stronger mystery is already enough human beings living in a now-desert world created a vast visual archive before writing, and we can see its surfaces without fully entering its mind. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives suggests ritual, storytelling, identity, and close attention to animals and water. The Green Sahara is not only a world of hunters. Over time, cattle become central in many areas. The appearance of cattle in rock art and archaeological sites points to pastoral communities moving through grasslands and lake margins, managing herds, following seasonal resources, and building social life around animals that are both food and wealth. Cattle are not merely walking meat. In many herding cultures, they become measures of status, bride wealth, sacrifice, identity, and relationship. We cannot simply project later traditions backward unchanged, but it is clear that cattle transform the human experience of the Sahara. A person who follows herds sees the land differently from a fisher or a grain gatherer. Waterholes, grazing routes, disease zones, and seasonal timing become part of social memory. Lakeside sites reveal another side of this vanished world. At places such as Gobero in the central Sahara, archaeologists have found evidence of human occupation during wetter periods, including burials that show changing populations and lifeways across time. Some graves contain bodies carefully placed, sometimes with ornaments, sometimes in ways that suggest grief and ritual attention. The people who live around these ancient lakes fish, hunt, gather, and later interact with pastoral lifeways. Their world is not empty wilderness. It is inhabited, revisited, and remembered. Then climate shifts, waters retreat, and occupation patterns change. Human presence pulses with the lakes, expanding when water returns and withdrawing when dryness takes hold. This rhythm of water and abandonment is one of the key differences between the Green Sahara and the better-known river valleys. Along the Nile or Euphrates, water may flood unpredictably, but it remains a central artery. In much of the Sahara, water is more temporary, more scattered, and eventually more vulnerable to long-term climate change. Communities adapt through mobility, flexible economies, and broad knowledge of terrain. They may not build cities in the later Mesopotamian sense, but that does not mean their world is simple. Managing life across a changing savanna-desert mosaic requires intelligence, cooperation, and memory as sophisticated as any settled farmer's field calendar. Then the rains begin to withdraw. The end of the Green Sahara does not happen everywhere on one exact day, and scholars still debate the speed and regional pattern of drying. In some places, the shift may be gradual. In others, ecological thresholds may make change feel sudden. Lakes shrink, grasslands retreat, dunes advance, animals move or die out locally. Routes that once connected communities become harder. What was once a human landscape becomes fragmented into refuges around remaining water. The great open corridors of the humid Sahara narrow, and people must choose new strategies, follow water south, move toward the Nile, adapt to oases, or transform their lifeways under pressure. This drying may have helped reshape the future of North Africa and the Nile Valley. As the Sahara becomes less forgiving, some populations likely move toward more reliable river systems and margins. The Nile, already important, becomes even more central as surrounding lands dry. It would be too simple to say that Egypt was created by refugees from the desert, because the formation of Egyptian civilization has many roots. But the climatic transformation of the Sahara is part of the larger background. People, animals, symbols, and pastoral traditions may have flowed toward the river as the green world faded. What survives in the record suggests connection, not isolation. The most surprising legacy of the Green Sahara may be psychological. It reminds us that landscapes can die in cultural memory while surviving in stone images. A desert can contain paintings of swimmers. A dry cliff can show cattle that once grazed nearby. A sand sea can hide fish bones. The modern Sahara looks ancient and eternal, but its emptiness is partly recent in deep time terms. Beneath the desert is a lost human geography of lake shores, camps, herding routes, burial grounds, and painted shelters. By the time Egypt's kings rise along the Nile, much of this older world has already withdrawn into memory, migration, and rock. The Sahara that once connected becomes a force that separates. The lakes vanish. The animals disappear from the living landscape. The people who painted them leave no names behind, yet their traces remain, spread across stone under the desert sun, quietly contradicting the idea that civilization began only in river cities. Before the pyramids, before Babylon, before Rome, North Africa held a green world of hunters, fishers, herders, artists, and travellers, and the desert still carries their vanished weather like a dream burned into rock. As the Sahara slowly loses its green skin, the Nile becomes more than a river. It becomes a line of survival drawn through a changing world. Long before pharaohs wear crowns, long before pyramids cast their clean geometry across the desert edge, people are already living beside its floods, watching its animals, burying their dead near its banks, and learning the moods of a waterway that will later be treated as divine. The Nile of this older time is not yet the stage of dynasties and royal monuments. It is a living corridor between Africa and the Mediterranean, between desert and marsh, between mobile herders, fishers, farmers, hunters, and communities whose names are gone. The river gives, but it does not give simply. Each year the flood rises from rains far to the south and spreads across the valley, renewing the soil with silt. To later Egypt, this rhythm becomes the foundation of agriculture, taxation, kingship, and sacred order. But before any of that, the flood is something people must learn through observation. It can nourish fields, fill channels, trap fish, and renew grazing land. It can also drown camps, shift banks, strand animals, and make movement difficult. A community that lives with the Nile must understand timing, elevation, storage, and risk. The earliest river people do not need writing to know that water is power. In the Nile Valley before dynastic Egypt, life is varied and changing. Some groups hunt wild animals, gather plants, fish the river, and move with seasonal opportunities. Others begin to rely more heavily on cultivated grain, domesticated animals, pottery, and more settled village life. Cattle hold special importance in many communities, linking the Nile world to the broader pastoral traditions of the fading green Sahara. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how much influence comes from local development. Desert populations moving toward the valley and contact with Southwest Asia. But what survives in the records suggests that the Nile is not isolated. It is a meeting place, absorbing people, ideas, animals, materials, and symbols from several directions. One of the most important early cultures in Upper Egypt is associated with Badarian communities, flourishing long before the First Dynasty. Their settlements and cemeteries reveal a world already rich in craft and social meaning. Fine pottery appears, sometimes with a blackened rim and polished surface, made with striking skill. People use stone tools, bone implements, beads, shells, ivory, and ornaments that point to exchange networks extending beyond the immediate village. Some graves contain more goods than others, hinting at social differences, though not yet the full machinery of monarchy. No single explanation fully accounts for how status forms in these early communities, but the beginnings are visible. Certain bodies receive more care, certain objects travel farther, certain symbols gather value. The cemeteries are especially revealing because the dead often preserve what settlements lose. Houses of mud, reed, and light materials vanish more easily than graves in the desert margin. In these burial grounds, people are placed carefully, sometimes wrapped, sometimes accompanied by pottery, pallets, beads, tools, or animal products. The desert, dry and patient, protects what the floodplain destroys. This creates a strange imbalance in the evidence. We may know more about how some people were buried than how they lived day by day. It is as if the dead speak more clearly than the living, though even their message is partial. Later, Naqada culture develops through stages that move Egypt closer to state formation. Painted pottery, boat imagery, animal figures, combs, pallets, mace heads, and increasingly elaborate graves suggest a society becoming more connected, more competitive, and more symbolically organized. Boats are particularly important. They appear not only as practical vehicles, but as images loaded with meaning. The Nile is a highway before roads, and boats allow goods, people, animals, ideas, an authority to move along the valley. Control of river movement may become one key to power. A leader who can command boats can command distance. Upper Egypt, especially places like Hierakonpolis, shows signs of growing complexity before unification. There are large cemeteries, craft production, elite burials, ritual spaces, and evidence for brewing and feasting on a scale that suggests organized gatherings. Beer, made from grain, is not just a drink in such a world. It is calories, ceremony, hospitality, labor payment, and social glue. A lesser-known but striking detail from early Egyptian contexts is the importance of large-scale food and drink production in creating obligation. Before taxation is written down, a feast can already gather people around power. The person who provides abundance becomes difficult to ignore. Animals also carry symbolic weight. Wild bulls, crocodiles, hippos, falcons, scorpions, and desert creatures appear in imagery before the fully developed gods of dynastic Egypt take their familiar forms. These animals are not random. They belong to a landscape of danger, strength, fertility, and royal possibility. The falcon that later becomes linked to kingship does not appear from nowhere. The crocodile and hippopotamus embody the river's threat. The bull carries force and virility. The desert edge is not empty. It is a symbolic frontier where wild power can be imagined, feared, and claimed. The Nile also teaches unity and division at the same time. The river connects communities north and south, but it also creates regional identities. Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt are different worlds in ecology, settlement, and orientation. The narrow valley of the south contrasts with the broad delta marshes of the north. The delta, wet and difficult to excavate because of later sediment and water, hides much of its earliest story. This means the formation of Egypt may look more southern in the archaeological record than it truly was. Scholars still debate the balance of power between regions before unification, partly because the evidence from the delta is harder to recover. What becomes clearer over time is that some communities begin to dominate others. Grave goods become more unequal. Symbols of authority grow more standardized. Trade reaches outward toward Nubia, the Red Sea, the Levant, and desert routes, copper, stone, shells, incense, oils, and exotic materials move into elite hands. Administrative habits begin to form before full writing. Marks on pottery, sealings, and controlled storage suggest that someone is keeping track of goods and identity. The king has not fully emerged, but the conditions for kingship are gathering. This is the hidden Nile before the pharaohs, not a blank river awaiting civilization, but a long corridor of experiments in farming, herding, burial, symbolism, exchange, feasting, violence, and leadership. When dynastic Egypt finally appears, it feels sudden because writing and monuments make it visible. But underneath that visibility is a slower world of ancestors, potters, boatmen, cattle keepers, brewers, hunters, and local leaders who learn the river's discipline over centuries. The pyramids will later make Egypt seem timeless, as if it rose complete from the desert. The older truth is more human. Egypt is built from mud, flood, memory, competition, and the patient observation of water. East of the Nile, beyond the deserts and highlands, another foundation of the ancient world is forming in mud, reed, water, and heat. Long before Babylon becomes a name that seems almost equal to civilization itself. Southern Mesopotamia is a difficult, shifting landscape where rivers refuse to behave like straight lines on a map. The Tigris and Euphrates descend from distant mountains carrying water, silt, and danger into a low alluvial plain. Their channels split, wander, flood, abandon old beds, and create marshes where land and water blur. To later kings, this region will become the heart of cities, temples, writing, law, astronomy, and empire. But before all of that, it is a frontier of settlement where people learn how to live with rivers that can feed them only if they are watched, guided, and sometimes forced. The earliest villages of southern Mesopotamia do not rise in an empty land. People have lived across northern Mesopotamia, the Zagros foothills, Anatolia, and the Levant for millennia, developing farming, herding, pottery, exchange, and ritual buildings. But the Deep South presents a different challenge. It has rich alluvial soils, reeds, fish, birds, and water. yet it lacks many basic resources. Later societies need good stone, timber, and metal are scarce. Everything useful beyond mud, reeds, clay, and river life must be brought from elsewhere. This makes southern Mesopotamia both vulnerable and powerful. It can produce grain and support dense populations, but it depends on networks reaching far beyond the plain. The Ubaid period, beginning well before the rise of Sumerian city-states, gives one of the clearest glimpses of this world before Babylon. Ubaid communities spread across southern Mesopotamia and beyond, leaving behind painted pottery, tripartite buildings, clay figurines, tools, graves, and signs of increasingly organized settlement. Their world is not yet the world of kings with armies and written boasts, but it is not simple village life either. At places such as Eridu, long remembered in later Mesopotamian tradition as one of the oldest cities, archaeologists find a long sequence of temples built and rebuilt on the same sacred spot. The earlier structures are modest compared with later ziggurats, but the pattern matters. Rebuilding in place creates continuity. A small shrine becomes a larger shrine. Sacred ground thickens through repetition. Eridu's deep temple sequence is one of the most powerful symbols of Mesopotamia before writing. Later myths will treat Eridu as a primordial city, a place where kingship descends from heaven. But archaeology shows something slower and more human underneath the myth. Generations return to the same site, maintain a special building, and preserve its importance across time. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how much authority these early temples held. But what survives suggests that communal ritual, storage, redistribution, and social identity are already becoming tied to architecture. A temple is not merely a place of worship. It can be a storehouse, a workplace, a meeting point, a symbol of shared labor, and eventually the center around which power gathers. Water is the central problem. In Egypt, the Nile flood has a broad rhythm that can be observed and eventually folded into a powerful ideology of order. In southern Mesopotamia, the rivers are less predictable and often more destructive. Irrigation becomes essential, not as a single invention, but as a long accumulation of small canals, levees, ditches, field systems, and local decisions. To bring water to fields, people must cooperate. To keep canals clear, they must return season after season. To manage flood and salinity, they must learn from failure. No single explanation fully accounts for the rise of Mesopotamian complexity. But irrigation creates a hard social fact. Water management binds households into obligations larger than themselves. This does not mean that irrigation automatically creates kings. That old idea is too simple. Communities can manage water in many ways, through kin groups, village councils, temple authorities, seasonal leaders, or negotiated labor. But over time, control over water, fields, storage, and labor gives certain people and institutions more influence. The canal is not just an engineering feature, it is a social relationship dug into the earth. Whoever decides when it is cleared, where it flows, and whose fields receive water first is already touching power. The Ubaid world also shows connection across astonishing distances. Ubaid-style pottery and cultural influence appear far beyond southern Mesopotamia, reaching into northern Mesopotamia, the Gulf region, and parts of Iran and Arabia. This spread does not necessarily mean conquest or migration on a large scale. It may reflect trade, emulation, shared styles, intermarriage, ritual exchange, or communities choosing to participate in a wider cultural language. Scholars still debate what Ubaid expansion really means, and the answer likely varies by region. But the pattern is clear enough before Babylon, before the great Sumerian city-states. Southern Mesopotamia is already part of a connected world. The Gulf may have mattered more than older histories once assumed. Lower sea levels during earlier periods and later changes in coastline mean that the head of the Gulf and surrounding wetlands have not always looked as they do now. Some ancient settlement zones may be buried under alluvium or submerged. Boats, reeds, fish, shell, bitumen, and exchange along waterways likely connected communities across marsh and coast. The marshes are not empty wastelands. They are productive, difficult, and full of movement. Reeds can build houses, boats, mats, baskets, and fences. Clay becomes pottery, bricks, tokens, and eventually tablets. Fish and birds feed people. Mud, often dismissed as humble, becomes the material from which urban civilization will later be made. A lesser-known but important detail of this early Mesopotamian world is how much it depends on materials from elsewhere. Obsidian, copper, timber, hard stone, and fine minerals move through exchange systems long before written merchants record transactions. This dependence encourages outward contact. A temple or large household that needs rare goods must maintain relationships beyond the local fields. The plain produces agricultural surplus. The mountains and distant regions provide materials. Out of this imbalance grows a habit of trade that later cities will expand dramatically. Human life in these settlements must have been demanding. Summers are severe. Floods can erase work. Irrigated fields can become salty if mismanaged, reducing fertility over time. Insects, waterborne disease, and marsh conditions shape daily experience. Yet the rewards are enormous. Grain grows, herds graze, fish and reeds are abundant, settlements expand, temples become more substantial, craftwork becomes more specialized. Social differences sharpen quietly, not yet as royal splendor, but as unequal access to goods, authority, and sacred space. By the time Babylon is still far in the future, the southern Mesopotamian plain has already learned the grammar of civilization canals, temples, storage, exchange, labor coordination, and symbolic authority. Writing has not yet fully emerged, but the need to remember quantities, offerings, goods, and obligations is growing. Kings have not yet carved their victories, but institutions are learning how to gather people around fields, water, and gods. The first cities will not appear from nothing. They will rise from mud brick villages, temple platforms, reed marshes, canal banks, and the long discipline of rivers that never stop moving. Across this older world, from the mud brick houses of Anatolia to the river settlements of Mesopotamia, from the Nile cemeteries to the fading grasslands of the Sahara, people keep leaving behind signs that seem to belong to a shared human need, the need to make meaning visible. Long before full writing, long before temple hymns, royal names, legal codes, and sacred books, the prehistoric world is already filled with images, marks, forms, and repeated gestures. A painted animal on a wall, a clay figurine held in the hand, a skull replastered and placed with care, a seal pressed into wet clay, a pattern repeated on pottery from one community to another. Each one is small compared with a pyramid or a palace, but together they form one of the deepest mysteries of the lost world before history. The difficulty is not that these objects are silent. In a sense, they speak too much. A figurine can suggest fertility, ancestry, play, protection, identity, teaching, ritual, or household memory. A painted bull can represent an actual animal, a dangerous force, a clan emblem, a feast, a myth, or a power that has no modern equivalent. A skull beneath a floor can be an ancestor, a trophy, a sacred relic, or a way of keeping the dead inside the social world of the living. Scholars still debate these meanings because the evidence remains incomplete. Without written explanation, archaeology must move carefully between pattern and imagination. between what survives in the ground and what modern people attempted to project onto it. One of the most widespread and haunting practices is the special treatment of human heads. In parts of the Neolithic Near East, skulls are sometimes removed after burial, covered with plaster, shaped to restore features, and occasionally given shell eyes or painted details. These are not casual remains, they require effort, timing, and intention. The face is reconstructed after death, not as a perfect portrait in the modern sense, but as a presence. The dead person, or the idea of that person, is made visible again. Some researchers interpret these skulls as ancestor veneration, a way for households or lineages to maintain ties to the past. Others suggest they may relate to status, ritual authority, or the control of memory. No single explanation fully accounts for the variation, but the practice reveals something profound in these communities. The dead do not simply disappear. This closeness between living and dead appears again in the burials beneath house floors at places like Çatalhöyük and other early settlements. A house can contain bodies from different moments in its own history, layered under platforms where ordinary life continues. The living cook, sleep, repair walls, and raise children above the buried dead. To modern eyes, this may seem unsettling, but in that world it may have created continuity. The house is not only a structure, it is a lineage, a memory vessel, a claim to belonging. Yet even this interpretation must remain cautious. What survives in the record suggests deep connections between household and ancestry, but the exact emotional and spiritual meaning is lost. Clay figurines add another layer. Across the Neolithic world, archaeologists find small human and animal forms, some carefully shaped, others rough, some broken, some deposited in houses, pits, or special contexts. Popular imagination often labels female figurines as mother goddesses, fertility idols, or evidence of a single ancient goddess religion. That idea can be appealing, but it is too broad and often unsupported. Some figurines may indeed relate to fertility, birth, gender, or protection, but others may have served as teaching tools, ritual objects, toys, symbols of identity, or temporary objects used and discarded. The same category may contain many meanings. A small clay body is not automatically a deity. The stronger mystery lies in the repetition of the human form itself. People are making people in miniature, holding bodies as symbols, and perhaps thinking about life, death, sex, age, and power through clay. Animal imagery is even more persistent. At Göbekli Tepe, wild creatures cover the pillars. At Çatalhöyük, bulls, deer, vultures, and other animals fill walls and installations. In the Sahara, cattle, giraffes, swimmers, and hunters move across rock faces. In early Egypt, falcons, crocodiles, scorpions, bulls, and hippos gather symbolic force before the fully formed gods of dynastic times. These animals are not merely background scenery, they occupy the center of human imagination. This is especially striking because many communities that rely increasingly on farming and herding still represent wild animals with extraordinary intensity. It is as if settling down does not tame the mind. The wild remains powerful precisely because daily life is becoming more controlled. Painted pottery also carries meaning beyond usefulness. A pot can store grain, cook food, serve drink, or hold offerings. But its surface can also declare belonging. Patterns, colors, shapes, and motifs travel between communities, sometimes marking cultural influence across wide regions. Ubaid pottery, with its distinctive painted designs, appears far beyond southern Mesopotamia. Naqada pottery in Egypt shows boats, animals, and symbolic scenes that seem to point toward emerging elite culture and ritual imagination. The same object can be practical and symbolic at once. A vessel may move through trade, marriage, ceremony, or burial, carrying not only food but style, memory, and social connection. Seals and sealings bring the story closer to administration, but not yet fully into writing. Before scribes record language on tablets, people in parts of the Near East begin using stamp seals or impressed marks to identify goods, containers, ownership, or authority. A seal is a small object with a large implication. It says that something needs to be marked, protected, counted, or recognized. It suggests trust and distrust at the same time. A sealed container implies that people care who has access, who sends goods, and whether something has been opened. Here symbolism begins to touch economy. A mark becomes a social guarantee. The path toward writing does not begin with poetry or royal glory, but with memory, control, and the need to make obligations visible. Yet many repeated signs from this world remain hard to classify. Some marks on stones, pottery, tokens, and walls seem deliberate, but whether they represent ownership, counting, ritual symbols, clan signs, decorative habits, or early steps toward notation is often uncertain. The temptation is to search for the first writing everywhere, as if every sign must be moving toward text. But the prehistoric world may have used symbols in ways that never became writing and were never meant to. A mark can belong to a ritual, a family, a craft tradition, a myth, or a moment of handling now gone forever. The deeper pattern is that people before the great civilizations are already building symbolic systems that bind communities together. They remember the dead through bodies and skulls. They shape animals into stone, paint, and clay. They mark pottery with shared designs. They seal goods. They carry ornaments over distance. They repeat gestures across generations. These signs do not let us translate their thoughts, but they prove that their world is not mute chaos before written order. It is dense with meaning, much of it organized, much of it shared, and much of it now unreachable. Later, civilizations will inherit this symbolic hunger and formalize it. Egypt will turn animals into gods and royal emblems. Mesopotamia will turn seals into bureaucratic tools and mythic images. Rome will fill public space with symbols of power, ancestry, and law. But the impulse begins far earlier, in houses with buried skulls, in clay bodies shaped by firelight, in painted vessels carried between settlements, and in animals carved into stone by people whose languages are gone. Before history can be written, it is imagined, marked, buried, painted, sealed, and remembered by hand. Objects move through the lost world before writing like quiet messengers. A stone blade found far from its volcanic source, a seashell carried inland beyond the sound of waves, a bead made from material that does not belong to the local ground, a lump of copper passed from mountain to plain. These things are small enough to fit in the hand, yet they reveal a world much larger than any single village. Before merchants write contracts, before caravans leave records, before ports list cargo, people are already connected by paths of exchange. The routes are mostly invisible now, erased by weather, farming, cities, and time, but the objects remain. They show that even in the deep prehistoric past, human communities are not sealed islands. They reach outward. Obsidian is one of the clearest clues. It forms from volcanic glass, dark, sharp, and beautiful, capable of being flaked into blades finer than many ordinary stones. Because obsidian sources have distinct chemical signatures, archaeologists can often trace a blade or flake back to a particular volcanic region. This makes it a kind of prehistoric fingerprint. When obsidian from Anatolia appears in settlements far away, it proves that materials are travelling across mountains, plains, and rivers long before written trade exists. The person using the blade may never have seen the volcano where it was born, but the object carries that distant landscape into their daily life. The movement of obsidian does not necessarily mean professional traders in the later sense. Exchange may happen through many hands, passed from one group to another through visits, marriages, seasonal gatherings, feasts, alliances, obligations, or ritual meetings. A blade might travel as a gift, a trade item, a sign of relationship, or a valued object passed down within a household. Scholars still debate how organized these networks were in different regions, and the evidence remains incomplete. But what survives suggests that prehistoric exchange is both practical and social. People are not only moving goods, they are creating trust, memory, and dependence across distance. Shells tell a similar story, but with a different feeling. Marine shells found far inland show that people value objects from environments beyond their own. A shell can become ornament, identity marker, amulet, status symbol, or memory of the sea. In some burials, beads and shells accompany the dead, suggesting that distant materials hold meaning beyond simple usefulness. A shell does not cut grain or dig soil. Its power lies in rarity, beauty, sound, colour, origin, and perhaps story. To wear something from a far coast is to carry a piece of elsewhere on the body. In a world without writing, the body itself becomes a display of connection. Copper begins as another rare and curious material. Long before bronze weapons and palace workshops, people encounter native copper, green-stained minerals, and malleable pieces that can be hammered into beads, pins, or small tools. At first, copper is not necessarily superior to stone for many tasks. A good flint or obsidian blade may be sharper and more practical, but copper has other qualities. It shines, it bends, it changes colour. It can be transformed by fire and hammering in ways stone cannot. Its early movement through exchange networks hints at a growing fascination with materials that seem almost alive under human hands. The later Metal Ages begin here, not with armies, but with experiment and desire. Lapis lazuli, when it enters ancient exchange systems from distant regions such as Afghanistan, becomes one of the most striking examples of long-distance value. Its deep blue colour is unlike common stone, and in later Mesopotamia and Egypt it becomes associated with wealth, sacred imagery and elite display. In the earlier world, its movement is more difficult to reconstruct, but the broader pattern is clear, rare materials from mountains, deserts, coasts, and riverlands begin to circulate through networks that no single village controls. These routes are the skeleton of future trade, though still covered in the flesh of kinship, ritual, and local custom. Timber is another crucial resource, especially in regions like southern Mesopotamia where good wood is scarce. Mud and reeds can build much, but not everything. Larger beams, boats, tools, and certain structures require wood from elsewhere. Stone, too, must be imported into alluvial plains where the earth gives clay but not hard rock. This imbalance shapes civilization before civilization fully appears. A community rich in grain but poor in stone must deal with mountain people. A river settlement with surplus food may exchange with highland communities that control minerals, timber, or obsidian. Geography creates need, and need creates relationship. Salt, though less glamorous, may be just as important. It preserves food, sustains bodies, and supports animals. Grain, dried fish, meat, hides, textiles, pigments, oils, and fibres all likely move in different ways across local and regional landscapes. Many of these materials leave poor archaeological traces, so the record can make prehistoric exchange look more focused on stone and shell than it truly was. Perishable goods vanish. The missing part of trade may have been enormous. What survives is only the hard remainder of a softer economy. Rivers make exchange easier, but they also shape its direction. The Nile, the Euphrates, the Tigris, the Jordan, and countless smaller waterways act as natural routes. Boats can carry more than human backs: reeds, timber, grain, animals, pottery, stone, and people move along water in ways that help settlements grow connected. In marshlands, boats are not luxury tools, they are extensions of the body. In river valleys, movement by water can turn scattered communities into corridors of communication. A river does not simply feed fields, it teaches distance. Overland routes matter too. Mountain passes, desert edges, grassland corridors, and seasonal migration paths become lines of contact. Herding people, hunters, farmers, fishers, and craft specialists may meet at ecological boundaries where different worlds touch. The edge between desert and river, mountain and plain, coast and inland valley can become a place of exchange because each side has what the other lacks. These encounters may be peaceful, tense, ceremonial, opportunistic, or all of these at once. No single explanation fully accounts for how exchange works everywhere, but the repeated appearance of distant objects shows that contact is persistent. Trade also changes thought. Once rare goods become desirable, communities begin to imagine value beyond immediate necessity. A bead can hold memory, a polished stone can signal identity, a seal can protect ownership, a fine pot can travel with a bride, a guest, a corpse, or an offering. Objects become social actors. They carry obligations. They prove relationships. They mark differences between people. Over time, the ability to acquire distant goods can become a source of status. A household with rare shells, exotic stone, or fine pigments may appear more connected, more blessed, or more powerful than others. This is how inequality and administration begin to approach the village without yet wearing royal clothing. Exchange creates opportunities for generosity, and generosity can create authority. A person or household able to host feasts, distribute rare goods, or maintain distant alliances gains influence. A ritual center that gathers people may also gather materials. A temple that stores grain may also receive offerings from far away. The line between sacred exchange and economic control is thin, and in many places it may not exist as a separate line at all. Before written history, trade is therefore not a background detail. It is one of the forces that makes larger worlds possible. It teaches people to trust strangers, measure value, remember obligations, desire rarity, and move beyond the horizon of their own fields. Later civilizations will build formal markets, tax systems, ports, roads, and merchant classes. But the habit of connection begins earlier, in the passing of obsidian, shell, copper, timber, pigment, salt, and grain from hand to hand. Beneath the empires lies this older web, fragile but far-reaching, spun by people who leave no ledgers behind, only objects out of place, waiting thousands of years for someone to notice how far they travelled. As villages grow older, another change begins to appear, quieter than monuments and less visible than trade, but just as important. Not everyone is buried the same way. Not every house contains the same objects. Not every workshop has the same access to rare stone, pigment, shell, copper, or fine pottery. Some places are rebuilt with unusual care. Some bodies receive ornaments that others do not. Some buildings stand closer to ritual power, storage, or communal attention. Inequality does not arrive all at once with a crown on its head. It enters slowly, through difference, memory, control, skill, and the ability to gather people or goods. In the earlier settled communities, the evidence for hierarchy is often subtle. Archaeologists do not find palaces everywhere, and they do not find royal graves in the later sense. Instead, they find uneven patterns. One burial may contain beads made from distant shells, while another contains almost nothing. One household may have more storage space, more decorated surfaces, more unusual objects, or more repeated rebuilding than its neighbours. A settlement may have a special building that is not exactly a temple in the later sense, but is clearly not an ordinary house either. What survives in the record suggests that social differences are forming, though scholars still debate how sharp those differences are and whether they represent wealth, ritual status, age, lineage, skill, or temporary leadership. This uncertainty matters because early inequality does not always look like later class society. A person may be honoured after death because of age, ancestry, healing knowledge, hunting ability, ritual role, or connection to a powerful household. A house may be important not because it is rich in private wealth, but because it belongs to a lineage that keeps certain memories or ceremonies. A storehouse may be communal in principle, while still managed by a few people in practice. Power can begin as service, obligation, and trust before it becomes command. No single explanation fully accounts for the slow emergence of rank, because human societies find many ways to make difference seem natural. Storage is one of the deepest roots of this transformation. In a mobile life, wealth is limited by what can be carried, shared, hidden, or quickly used. In a settled village, food can accumulate, grain can sit in bins, dried meat, fish, nuts, seeds, and other supplies can be kept against winter, drought, or failed harvests. Storage creates security, but it also creates a dangerous question: who guards it, who measures it, who receives it, and who decides when it is opened. A full granary is not only food, it is future time made visible, and whoever controls future time holds a kind of power. At first, control may be practical. Someone has to organize harvest labor. Someone has to repair storage pits. Someone has to remember which household contributed what. Someone has to keep pests, moisture, and theft away. Yet practical roles can become social authority. A person trusted to manage surplus may become difficult to challenge. A family associated with successful storage may gain prestige. A ritual specialist who blesses the harvest or oversees offerings may stand close to the food supply in both symbolic and material ways. The line between sacred duty and economic advantage can blur until no one in the village experiences it as a line at all. Feasting adds another layer. Across many early societies, large meals create bonds and obligations. To host a feast requires surplus, planning, vessels, fuel, labour, and often animals or grain in significant quantity. The host gives, but the gift is not simple generosity. It creates memory. It places others in a relationship of gratitude, rivalry, or debt. People who can repeatedly provide abundance may become leaders without needing formal titles. A feast can celebrate ancestors, mark a seasonal rite, seal marriages, resolve tension, display wealth, or gather workers for communal projects. In a world without written contracts, eating together can become a form of political architecture. Craft specialization also helps separate people from one another. In a small community, many tasks are shared, but some skills demand unusual knowledge: shaping fine obsidian blades, firing pottery successfully, drilling tiny beads, working copper, preparing pigments, carving stone, building ritual structures, or brewing large amounts of beer. A skilled craftsperson may depend on others for food while producing objects that carry value across the settlement and beyond. Over time, skill can become status, and status can become inherited or controlled. A workshop is never just a workplace. It can be a doorway into networks of exchange and influence. The body itself preserves some of these changes. Skeletons can show differences in diet, workload, injury, disease, and access to food. Some people bear the marks of heavy labour more strongly than others. Some may eat more meat or higher quality foods. Some children show signs of stress while others appear better nourished. These patterns are difficult to interpret, and the evidence remains incomplete, but they remind us that inequality is not only an idea, it enters bones, teeth, joints, and growth. Social difference eventually becomes biological experience. Burial is where many of these differences become most visible. In the Nile Valley before dynastic Egypt, grave goods become increasingly unequal over time. In Mesopotamia and surrounding regions, some graves or buildings show access to special objects. In Neolithic communities, certain skulls, bodies, or household burials receive unusual attention. The dead become a stage on which the living display memory and rank, but burial wealth is tricky. A rich grave may honour the dead person's own status, or it may express the ambitions of survivors. A child buried with valuable goods may reveal inherited position rather than personal achievement. This is one of the strongest signs that social inequality is beginning to outlive individual life. Violence may also play a role, though it should not be exaggerated into a simple story of constant warfare. Some early settlements show signs of injury, fortification, burning, or conflict. Others do not. Competition over land, water, herds, stored food, trade routes, or ritual prestige may have created tensions that sometimes turn deadly. But cooperation remains just as essential. Villages cannot survive only by force. They require shared labour, marriage ties, mutual aid, seasonal knowledge, and the repeated repair of relationships. Early power grows in the uneasy space between cooperation and control. This is why the rise of inequality feels so human. It does not require villains. It can begin with good harvests, respected elders, successful hunters, careful managers, generous hosts, skilled makers, or families trusted with ritual memory. Then advantage accumulates. A little more grain becomes a little more influence. A distant contact brings rare goods. A special burial becomes a claim of ancestry. A house becomes associated with power. A child is born into a name that already matters. By the time kings appear, much of the groundwork has already been laid. The lost world before Egypt, Babylon, and Rome is therefore not only the story of humans learning to settle, it is the story of humans learning to become unequal in new ways. The first villages create closeness, but closeness makes comparison unavoidable. People see who has more, who gives more, who commands attention, who speaks in ritual moments, who controls storage, who marries whom, who is buried with ornaments, and who is forgotten with almost nothing. Out of mud brick houses, grain bins, graves, feasts, and workshops comes the first architecture of rank. It is not yet monarchy, but it is the soil from which monarchy can grow. The same landscapes that teach people how to stay also teach them how fragile staying can be. A village may feel permanent after generations of rebuilt walls, buried ancestors, worn paths, storage pits, and fields known by touch. But the earth does not promise to hold still around it. Rain shifts, rivers change course, springs weaken, lakes retreat from their old shores. Floods arrive too high or too low. Soil grows tired, salty, or thin. Forests move. Herds follow greener ground. What seems like a homeland can become, over several human lifetimes, a place that no longer answers the habits built around it. This is one of the central tensions in the lost world before Egypt, Babylon, and Rome. Settlement creates memory, but climate can break the places where memory lives. A mobile group may lose a camp, but a settled community can lose a whole inherited world: houses, graves, fields, shrines, storage systems, and the social order tied to them. The deeper people root themselves in a landscape, the more painful it becomes when that landscape begins to change. The evidence remains incomplete. Because abandonment can look similar whether people leave from drought, conflict, disease, soil exhaustion, opportunity, or some mixture of pressures. But the pattern appears again and again. Early communities rise, endure, transform, and sometimes vanish into layers of earth. Climate change in this ancient world is not a single villain moving across the map. It is uneven, regional, and often difficult to separate from human choices. A dry century may weaken one valley while another adapts. A cooling event may shorten growing seasons in one zone but matter less near a reliable river. A river shift may ruin one settlement and enrich another. Scholars still debate how directly particular climate events caused particular social changes, and they are right to be cautious. People are not passive leaves blown by weather. They respond, experiment, migrate, reorganize, intensify production, change crops, move animals, deepen storage, or turn toward ritual and authority. Yet there are moments when no response is enough to preserve the old pattern. The Younger Dryas, that cold and dry interruption near the end of the Ice Age, had already shown how environmental stress could disturb communities living at the edge of new settlement. Later shifts continue to test early societies. In the Levant and surrounding regions, rainfall patterns matter intensely for grain, wild plants, grazing, and water sources. A settlement that thrives during wetter generations may become difficult to maintain when the rains fail. Storage can soften hunger for a time, but stored grain is not magic. It runs out. Herds need pasture. Children need food every season. Not only in good years, the village, for all its promise, becomes a wager against uncertainty. In southern Mesopotamia, the problem often takes the form of water's excess and absence together. Rivers flood, but not always helpfully. Irrigation opens new possibilities, yet it carries long-term risks. If fields are watered again and again in hot, dry conditions, salts can accumulate in the soil. Over time, salinity can reduce yields and force changes in crops, fields, or settlement patterns. No single explanation fully accounts for the rise and fall of early Mesopotamian communities, but ecological stress is part of the story from the beginning. The very systems that allow dense life can become traps when they require constant repair and careful balance. Along the Nile, the river's rhythm is more dependable in broad terms, but even there, life depends on the flood's behavior. Too little water means poor fields. Too much water can destroy homes, stores, and boundaries. The sacred order later associated with Egypt rests on a natural rhythm that people cannot command. Before kings claim to guarantee balance, communities already know that survival depends on forces beyond human negotiation. The river can make authority powerful, but it can also expose authority's limits. The Sahara offers the most dramatic lesson. The Green Sahara does not collapse in a single instant, but its drying transforms an inhabited world into a harsher one. Lakes shrink, pastures retreat, wet corridors break apart. People who once moved through broad living landscapes must follow remaining water, shift toward river valleys, adapt to oases, or leave old routes behind. Rock art remains on cliffs after the animals disappear. Fish bones remain where no fish can live. Human memory must have carried stories of lost waters, but memory itself cannot refill a lake. In time, the desert covers not only camps and graves, but the logic of entire ways of life. Environmental stress also erases evidence, making the lost world even harder to recover. Floodplains bury settlements under silt. Rivers cut away old banks. Rising seas drown coastal camps, fishing grounds, and perhaps whole networks of early human activity. Desert winds strip surfaces or bury them under dunes. Later farmers plough through earlier villages without knowing what lies beneath. Cities grow on top of older towns. Reservoirs submerge sites before they can be fully studied. The record does not disappear evenly. Some places survive because they are burned, buried, dried, or abandoned at just the right moment. Others vanish because the landscape that held them never stops moving. This uneven survival can distort the story. A culture may seem less important simply because its houses were made of perishable materials. Its dead were not buried in dry ground. or its settlements lie beneath modern water or cities. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but it is also not proof of hidden grandeur. Archaeology has to live between those two dangers. It must not invent what is lost, but it must also remember how much loss there has been. When stress grows, people carry pieces of their worlds with them. A migrating group cannot bring a lake, a field system, or a mound of ancestral houses, but it can bring seeds, animals, tools, ornaments, songs, marriage ties, burial habits, craft knowledge, and stories about where the ancestors once lived. This is how collapse can also become transmission. The end of one settlement may feed the beginning of another. The drying of one region may strengthen a river valley. The abandonment of a village may spread technologies, symbols, or social habits elsewhere. What looks like disappearance from one place may be transformation across a wider map. Still, the human cost should not be softened too much. To leave a settlement is to leave the dead beneath the floor, the hearth repaired by grandparents, the field cleared by parents, the path taken since childhood, the hill where ceremonies gathered, the water source that once made staying possible. Climate history can sound abstract when described in dates and curves, but it enters life as hunger, argument, difficult movement, failed expectations, and the quiet decision that the old place can no longer hold everyone. Before the First Empire's right of order, the older world already knows instability. Its people build, store, herd, farm, bury, paint, and trade under skies that keep changing. Some communities endure by adapting, others scatter, others are forgotten so completely that only a layer of ash, a line of abandoned houses, or a few seeds in dry soil remain. Climate turns against memory, but it does not erase everything. It leaves enough traces to show that the foundations of civilization were laid not in a stable paradise, but in a world of risk, resilience, and repeated loss. Out of this unstable world of drying lakes, shifting rivers, crowded houses, stored grain, and remembered dead, the first true cities begin to approach. They do not arrive like a sudden invention. They gather slowly, almost quietly at first, as older village habits become too large for the village to contain. A shrine rebuilt again and again becomes a temple complex. A storage room becomes an administrative centre. A skilled household becomes a workshop. A seasonal gathering becomes a permanent crowd. A leader who once organised a feast or canal repair begins to command labour more regularly. The road towards cities is not a road away from the prehistoric world, but a road made from its materials mud brick, grain, water, ritual, exchange, and obligation. In southern Mesopotamia, this transformation becomes especially visible. Settlements grow larger, temples more important, and labour more coordinated. Places that begin as villages or ritual centres develop into early urban communities, where thousands of people live in close relationship with fields, canals, workshops, and sacred buildings. Uruk is the name most often attached to this great turn, though it is not alone. By the late 4th millennium BCE, long before Babylon's famous kings, Uruk expands into something far beyond an ordinary settlement. Its scale, architecture, craft production, and administrative tools suggest a society learning how to manage complexity in new ways. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate exactly how power operates in these early urban centres, but the change is unmistakable. The city is not simply a large village. Size changes everything. In a village, many people may know one another by face, kinship, reputation, or memory. In a city, strangers become part of daily life. Food must come from fields beyond the immediate household. Labour must be organised across groups who do not all share the same ancestors. Goods must be stored, counted, moved, and redistributed. Conflicts multiply, specialization deepens. Some people farm, others make pottery, weave textiles, shape stone, brew beer, build walls, carve seals, keep accounts, or serve temple institutions. The city creates dependence between people who may never sit at the same hearth. Administration grows out of that dependence. Before full writing, people used tokens, sealings, clay envelopes, impressed marks, and counting systems to track goods and obligations. This is one of the most surprising details of the road to cities writing does not begin as literature, philosophy, or royal storytelling. It begins largely with accounting, sheep, grain, jars of oil, measures of beer, labour duties, and deliveries have to be remembered beyond the limits of human memory. Clay becomes a technology of trust. A mark pressed into clay can say that goods were received, sealed, counted, or controlled. Eventually, these practical systems help open the path toward cuneiform writing, but their roots lie in the older need to make exchange and storage visible. Temples stand near the centre of this process. Though they should not be imagined only as quiet places of prayer, early temple institutions can gather grain, employ workers, sponsor craft production, host rituals, organize offerings, and hold symbolic authority. Sacred buildings become economic engines as well as religious centers. The god's household, in later Mesopotamian terms, can function like a vast human institution, even before we can read clear texts explaining everything. The architecture and administrative remains suggest that ritual power and material power are becoming deeply intertwined. No single explanation fully accounts for the rise of the temple economy, but it grows from older patterns already seen in smaller settlements, special buildings, communal labour, storage, feasting, and sacred memory. The same broad movement appears in different forms elsewhere. In the Nile Valley, local centres grow more powerful, elite graves become richer, and symbols of authority become more standardised before Egypt is unified under kings. In the Indus region, still earlier village traditions eventually lead toward the great urban civilization of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. Though that development follows its own path and comes later than the earliest Mesopotamian cities, in each region, the city is not the same creature. Some urban worlds emphasize temples and visible kingship. Others organize space, craft, and trade with fewer obvious royal monuments. This matters because civilization is not one formula repeated everywhere. It is a family of experiments. At the heart of the early city is surplus, but surplus alone is not enough. Grain can feed specialists, but someone must coordinate the system that grows, collects, stores, protects, and distributes it. Craft production can create wealth, but someone must acquire raw materials and move finished goods. Ritual can gather people, but someone must maintain the calendar, the buildings, the offerings, and the authority of sacred spaces. Cities grow when these systems begin reinforcing one another. More people require more food. More food allows more specialists. More specialists create more goods. More goods demand more administration. More administration strengthens institutions. Institutions draw more people. The circle becomes difficult to reverse. This does not mean early cities are peaceful machines of progress. They are crowded, unequal, and vulnerable. Disease spreads more easily where people, animals, waste, and water are concentrated. Labour can become heavier and more controlled. Some people gain access to rare goods, better food, or ritual authority, while others do the hard work that keeps the system alive. Walls, weapons, and burned layers remind us that competition and violence are never far away. Though the evidence varies by site and period, the city offers opportunity, but it also invents new forms of pressure. A lesser-known but important feature of early urban life is the standardization of simple things. Bowls, bricks, weights, seal designs, and measures begin to become more regular in some contexts. Standardization sounds dull, but it is revolutionary. A standardized bowl can serve rations. A standardized brick makes large construction more efficient. A standardized measure allows goods to be counted across households and institutions. Regularity becomes a quiet language of control. Before law is carved into stone, daily objects begin teaching people to live inside systems larger than themselves. The road towards cities also changes the imagination of space. A village may center on households and ancestors, but a city creates districts, processional ways, storage areas, workshops, temples, walls, and outer fields. People begin to experience society as something spatially arranged. Some areas are more sacred, some more productive, some more elite, some more crowded, some more controlled. Power becomes visible in architecture. A raised platform or monumental facade can make authority feel older, higher, and more inevitable than the humans who built it. Yet beneath the new urban forms, the older world remains present. Temples inherit the sacred places of earlier communities. Administrative marks grow from earlier tokens and seals. Urban trade expands older exchange routes. Kingship, when it emerges, draws on older ideas of feasting, protection, ancestry, and control over water and grain. Even the city's walls are built from the same mud that held the first village houses together. The famous civilizations will later claim order as if it descends fully formed from gods, kings, or law. But in truth, order is assembled slowly from generations of practical problems. By the time the first cities stand, the world before Egypt, Babylon, and Rome is no longer merely before, it is underneath. Its experiments have become foundations. The city rises from the village, the temple from the shrine, writing from counting, kingship from stored authority, and empire from networks that once carried shells and obsidian by hand. The road towards cities is therefore not the end of the lost world. It is the moment when parts of that world become visible enough to cast long shadows into history. The closer the ancient world moves toward writing, the more tempting it becomes to treat writing as the beginning of real history. A clay tablet with signs can name goods, workers, places, gods, rulers, and debts. A carved monument can announce victory. A seal can identify an office. A royal list can arrange the past into a line of kings. Writing gives history a voice that seems firm, almost official, and once that voice appears, everything before it can feel like silence. But the silence is deceptive. It is not the silence of people without memory. It is the silence of memory that was carried in bodies, objects, songs, gestures, houses, landscapes, and rituals rather than in permanent words. For most of human existence, no one writes anything down. This does not mean people live without history. They remember migrations, marriages, floods, ancestors, hunting grounds, sacred places, betrayals, feasts, disasters, and rules. They teach children where water can be found, which plants are safe, which stones flake well, which animals must be avoided, which dead must be honoured, and which stories explain why the world is arranged as it is. But oral memory is alive, and because it is alive, it changes, adapts, and disappears when the people who carry it disappear. Archaeology can recover the bowl, the wall, the grave, and the tool. It cannot easily recover the story told beside the hearth. This is one of the deepest losses in the world before Egypt, Babylon, and Rome. We can see complexity, but we cannot hear its explanations. We can find a house full of burials and know that the dead matter, but we do not know the names spoken over them. We can see cattle painted across Sahara stone, but we do not know whether they belong to myth, wealth, memory, prayer, or all of these at once. We can trace obsidian across hundreds of kilometers, But we do not know the promises made when it changed hands. We can uncover a ritual building, but not the rhythm of the ceremony that filled it. What survives in the record suggests rich mental worlds, but those worlds are damaged before we arrive. The damage is not evenly distributed. Stone survives better than wood. Pottery survives better than baskets. Burned grain survives better than fresh bread. Bones survive better than skin, hair, cloth, and voice. A society that builds in mud brick may leave deep settlement mounds, while a society that builds with reeds, hides, or timber may almost vanish. A cemetery in dry desert can preserve bodies and ornaments, while a village on a wet floodplain dissolves into mud. This means that the archaeological record is not a fair witness. It favours certain materials, climates, accidents, and customs. The people most visible to us are not always the most important people of their own time. Even within a single community, preservation can distort reality. A grave may look rich because objects survive there, while the living world of perishable mats, painted cloth, wooden bowls, leather bags, songs, meals, and spoken law is gone. A temple may appear central because its foundations endure, while ceremonies in open fields leave little trace. Stone tools may seem to dominate life because they survive, while nets, baskets, ropes, boats, and clothing may have been just as essential. The evidence remains incomplete, and the missing material is not a minor detail. It is often the texture of daily life itself. Names are among the greatest absences. Later civilizations fill the world with names kings, gods, cities, battles, dynasties, officials, enemies, builders, fathers, sons. Names make the past feel populated. Before writing, almost all names vanish. The woman who grinds grain until her joints ache, the child buried beneath a house floor, the carver who shapes an animal into a limestone pillar, the herder who knows every waterhole in a green Sahara, the fisher who reads the Nile's backwaters, the builder who replasters the same wall for the 10th time all become anonymous. Their work survives, but their identities do not. This anonymity can make them seem less real, though in truth they are the human majority of history. Without writing, political events also dissolve. There may have been alliances, rivalries, raids, marriages between distant groups, disputes over water, charismatic leaders, ritual reforms, and remembered disasters that shaped entire regions. Some of these events may be hinted at by burned layers, abandoned settlements, unusual burials, or sudden changes in material culture. But the meaning is uncertain. A burned house may be accident, warfare, ritual closure, or later disturbance. A new pottery style may signal migration, imitation, exchange, or changing taste. Scholars still debate such evidence because prehistoric events rarely announce themselves. They must be inferred from patterns that can carry more than one explanation. This is why caution matters. The lost world invites imagination, but imagination can easily become false certainty. It is tempting to turn every large monument into proof of a forgotten empire, every symbol into a lost script, every unexplained object into evidence of a hidden advanced civilization. Popular stories often do this because mystery sells, but the real mystery is more demanding and more powerful. People without writing built complex worlds that do not need invented empires to be impressive. Their achievements are visible in cooperation, adaptation, craft, ritual, exchange, and the shaping of landscapes over generations. Unsupported theories often flatten that complexity by replacing human patience with fantasy. Still, mainstream archaeology also has to remain humble. The absence of writing means that many interpretations are provisional. A site can be re-understood when new excavations reveal houses where only ritual was expected, or storage where only worship was imagined, or ordinary labour behind objects once called sacred. Scientific methods add more tools: radiocarbon dating, ancient DNA, isotope analysis, residue studies, microbotany, soil chemistry, remote sensing, and underwater archaeology. These methods can tell us what people ate, where they moved, what materials they used, how old a layer is, and sometimes how populations were related. Yet even the most advanced technique cannot fully restore a vanished worldview. Ancient DNA, for example, can reveal ancestry, migration, kinship, and population mixture, but it cannot tell us what people thought those relationships meant. Isotope analysis can show that a person grew up elsewhere, but not whether they arrived as a spouse, captive, trader, pilgrim, refugee, or honoured guest. Residues in pottery can reveal milk, wine, oil, or cooked plants, but not the story of the meal. Science sharpens the image, but it does not remove the veil entirely. What was lost without writing, then, is not simply information. It is perspective from the inside. We see these people from above, through ruins and samples, while they saw themselves from within a living world of obligations, fears, jokes, taboos, memories, and sacred expectations. They didn't know they were prehistoric. They did not know they were preparing the foundations for Egypt, Babylon, or Rome. They lived in the present, as all people do, making choices under pressure, repeating customs that felt ancient to them, and changing the future without naming it. Yet perhaps that is why their traces are so moving. A written king often tells us exactly how he wants to be remembered. A prehistoric hearth does not. It simply remains, darkened by use, surrounded by fragments of meals, tools, and ordinary survival. The world before writing asks to be approached not as emptiness, but as a damaged archive. Its pages are mud, bone, ash, seed, pigment, and stone. Much has been torn away, much was never meant to last. But enough remains to show that before official history began, human beings were already living inside deep histories of their own. By the time Egypt, Babylon, and Rome step onto the stage of written history, they seem so massive that they can make everything before them appear small. Egypt rises with kings who claim cosmic balance, pyramids aligned against the desert sky, temples renewed across millennia, and a river turned into a sacred engine of power. Babylon becomes a city of walls, gods, scribes, law, mathematics, omens, and imperial memory. Rome arrives much later with roads, armies, aqueducts, legal habits, and an appetite for organizing the world under one name. These civilizations feel like beginnings because they know how to announce themselves. They write, build, conquer, count, and preserve their own importance in stone, clay, and legend. But underneath them lies an older world that has already done much of the hardest work. That older world is not a single lost empire, and it should not be forced into one. It is a patchwork of hunters, fishers, farmers, herders, ritual builders, traders, craft workers, ancestors, migrants, and village communities spread across changing landscapes. Some live beside rivers that later become famous. Some live in deserts that are still green. Some gather around stone pillars before cities exist. Some build mud brick houses so densely that rooftops become streets. Some carry obsidian across mountains, shells into the interior, cattle into drylands, and symbols across generations. They do not know Egypt, Babylon, or Rome as future heirs. They are not preparing a grand plan. Yet what survives in the record suggests that their experiments become the deep grammar of later civilization. Egypt inherits far more than land along the Nile. It inherits centuries of watching floodwater, managing cattle, burying the dead with care, treating animals as symbols of danger and power, moving goods along the river, and concentrating prestige in certain graves, feasts, and ritual places. When kingship finally becomes visible, it appears with breathtaking force. But the habits that make it possible are older. The falcon does not become royal in a vacuum. The desert edge does not become sacred from nowhere. The authority of the ruler grows from long traditions of local leadership, ritual display, river control, and social inequality. Scholars still debate the precise route from pre-dynastic communities to the unified Egyptian state, but no serious account begins with nothing. Babylon, too, rests on foundations older than its name. Before Babylonian law, there are accounting systems. Before famous temples, there are shrines rebuilt on the same sacred ground. Before written literature, there are symbolic worlds of animals, gods, ancestors, and forces already shaping how people imagine order. Before kings regulate land and labour, people have learned to dig canals, store grain, seal containers, manage exchange, and coordinate work beyond the household. Southern Mesopotamia's later brilliance depends on mud, reeds, clay, flood, salinity, scarcity, and connection. Its cities rise because earlier communities have learned how to turn difficult environments into organised landscapes. Rome stands farther away in time, but it too belongs to this deeper inheritance. By the time Rome builds roads, the human habit of making routes meaningful is already ancient. By the time Roman law defined property and obligation, people have spent thousands of years negotiating land, storage, labour, exchange, marriage, ancestry, and status. By the time Rome fills its forums with public memory, humans have long been marking power in special places, burying identity into landscapes, and using architecture to make authority feel permanent. Rome's world is iron, Latin, empire, and stone. But beneath it are older human problems: how to feed crowds, organise labour, remember the dead, bind strangers, display rank, and make fragile systems appear eternal. The lost world before these civilizations is therefore not merely a prologue, it is the deep structure. Its people discover that staying in one place creates memory and burden. They learn that farming can feed more people while demanding more labour. They learn that animals can be hunted, herded, feared, worshipped, painted, and owned. They learn that surplus can protect a community and divide it. They learn that rare objects can carry value far beyond usefulness. They learn that special buildings can gather power. They learn that the dead can remain socially present. They learn that climate can undo generations of certainty. This world also leaves behind a warning. Many of its achievements are vulnerable. Lakes vanish. Settlements are abandoned. Coastlines drown. Ritual centres are buried. Languages disappear before they are recorded. Entire ways of life survive only as rock art. Charred seeds, bones, tools, or chemical traces in soil. The evidence remains incomplete, and some parts of the story may never be recovered. The most famous civilizations later try to defeat this fragility with monuments and writing. But even they fail in the end. Their temples break. Their scripts are forgotten for centuries. Their cities become ruins. The same silence that covers the village eventually reaches the empire. And yet disappearance is not the same as failure. Many early communities vanish as named cultures, but their choices continue inside later worlds. The domesticated wheat in a granary, the sheep in a flock, the canal beside a field, the seal on a jar, the ancestor beneath a house, the sacred animal on a wall, the route between mountain and plain. These are survivals deeper than royal names. History often remembers the people who command. But civilization is built just as much by people who grind grain, repair walls, shape pots, carry water, tend animals, bury children, clear canals, and pass knowledge through hands. The lost world before Egypt, Babylon, and Rome remains half vanished because it stands before the age of explanation. It does not tell us what it thinks of itself. It does not leave chronicles of its migrations, songs, feasts, griefs, rivalries, or sacred fears. But it leaves enough to change the way the famous ancient world is understood. The first great civilizations are not sudden miracles rising from emptiness. They are the visible peaks of a mountain range mostly buried beneath time. Under the pyramids lies the village. Under Babylon lies the canal bank and the clay token. Under Rome lies the long human memory of roads, fields, laws before writing, and ancestors before archives. The world before history never truly disappears. It becomes the ground history stands on. When the story widens out, the old world grows quiet again. The stone pillars settle back into their hill. The painted cattle remain on desert walls, watching a landscape that no longer feeds them. The mud brick houses soften into mounds. The river silt rises over forgotten floors. The sea moves over coastlines where fires once burned at night, across thousands of years. Names fade first, then languages, then the meanings of signs, then the memory of why a skull was kept, why a wall was painted, why a vessel was buried, why a path mattered. But the silence is not empty. It is full of beginnings. Somewhere in that silence, people learn to trust seeds and fear failed rain. They learn to store grain against a future they cannot see. They learn to live with animals close enough to change both species. They learn to gather strangers through ritual, food, exchange, and obligation. They learn that a house can hold the dead and the living together. They learn that water is never only water, that land is never only land, and that memory needs places where it can rest. The famous civilizations come later with brighter edges. Egypt cuts its monuments against the sun. Babylon presses order into clay. Rome lays stone roads across distance. Their remains are easier to see, easier to name, easier to place in books. Yet beneath them is the older human labour that rarely receives a monument, the first repaired roof, the first field watched through a dry season, the first canal cleared by tired hands, the first child taught the path to water, the first ancestor remembered beneath a flaw. Time does not preserve fairly. It favours stone, fire, dryness, accident, and power. So the people of the older world reach us in fragments, and we must meet them there with care, not as shadows waiting for civilization, but as human beings already living inside complicated worlds of risk, belief, hunger, skill, and hope. They are gone, but not absent. They remain in the crops, the animals, the towns, the roots, the symbols, and the questions that later ages inherit without always knowing from whom. And at the edge of the story, the landscape remains. A river moves through reeds. Wind crosses a dry basin that once held water. A buried wall waits under a field. Somewhere below the surface of history, the lost world is still there, quiet, patient, and unfinished.